Second, in terms of hydro, for example, this administration has been very vocal of rehabilitating the 60 hydro plants. Actually, López Obrador has said that he considers to be the most cheapest and cleanest source. In terms of what other source? Natural gas, hydro. Well,
nuclear was just mentioned.
Nuclear, for example. In Mexico, we have one nuclear plant, Laguna Verde. And this administration had said that is evaluating to increase the production with that source, because right now it's only 4%. She actually said that this was decided after CETA week. Now, what to expect in terms of the industry? What does that mean for the industry? Well, in terms of the potential of the different sources, not going anywhere. If we continue to read the news almost every week, we see the progress of certain companies that want, as a result of the auctions, but they're trying to redefine their strategy in terms of the auctions. Well, before that, let me put you two examples of how they are trying to redefine. Enel and Iberdrola. Enel, for example, have been in Mexico for the last 10 years. It's probably the only company that won in the 3 auctions, and their communication strategy is that they will continue to fulfill the 3,000 megawatts due to the $3 billion of investment. On the other hand, for example, Iberdrola has changed its strategy. After 20 years of supplying to CFE, they have said that they're going to supply to the industry. And for 2020, they expect a $5 billion of investment to supply to the industry. Now, the third point, renewables and goals. Well, after 3 auctions that Lisa mentioned, with very competitive prices, $20 megawatt hour, more than 40 companies, 9,000 megawatts expected, $9 billion of investment. They suspended the 4th auction, but Secretary Nale has said that there will be another auction, but conditioned to prioritize the building of transmission lines. She claims that there has been an energy imbalance from the last administration that is based on the bureaucracy, the excessive bureaucracy from CRE, and the excessive permits from CRE, but also they have not guaranteed the connection to transmission lines to the grid. So what can we expect in terms of our goals? Well, let's start to where we stand right now. Of the first auction, we are on 76% of progress. The second auction, 72% of progress. And the third one, 0%, but the obligation is not until next year. So we're talking about 6,000 megawatts of the first and second auction. And then our first goal, I believe we're going to meet in 2020. We're talking about 30%. And the reason why, because right now we're around 25%. But I have my doubts that we are going to be able to meet our goals in 2024, 35%. And it will depend on the progress of the third auction, but also in when and how is going to be the fourth auction. And also there are other mechanisms that the privates are pushing forward that also might help on this, but I can talk about this on the Q&A session. With that, I'll leave this my comments, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you. Right, so the auctions that already took place, the projects are either built or being built. There's some delays, but there's certainly going to be a lot of new capacity. So the problem is in the longer term, if there are no auctions, how are they going to meet that target? So let me turn to Tirso. So and ask you specifically about Argentina, a country that your company is in, and APR Energy provides kind of emergency power solutions. So, I think what I want to ask you is, why does your company need to be in Argentina? Argentina, a huge country with a lot of resources. Why do they, need to have emergency power? What are the problems that they're facing?
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. So Argentina is a perfect example of the two issues you pointed out when you first started, the introduction of new power and transition into renewable, and the need for reliability. So our presence in Argentina is curious one, because as you mentioned, the nature of our business is temporary power, is filling a gap while permanent solutions are put in place. And we entered Argentina in 2006 during the Fernandez government, because from my perspective, their philosophy was more of a paternal approach to power, which was power, electricity at any cost. We just have to provide the people what they need. Unfortunately, the foreign investment wasn't there, and infrastructure did not keep up with demand, and they found themselves in an emergency, which is our natural business. We entered under that scenario into a 2-year contract, and with us, 2 gigawatts of emergency power. This was unprecedented anywhere in the world. It happened because of this approach to, we just got to solve this problem. As time progressed, the investments didn't come. The country did not take the necessary actions to address the growth in demand, and what was scheduled to be temporary became a permanent solution. They took on an approach of putting in distributed generation throughout the country. Argentina has the problem of being a large expanse of territory, but their population is sparsed out. So their biggest problem was actually transmission more than generation. And we became effectively a permanent power plant with a temporary solution. When the Macri government took office, they did a complete 180 on the philosophy and said, no, we need to take a economic approach to how the system is administrated. So they basically said, we're going to use dispatch by cost only. And in my opinion, it was a bit too radical as well in the change. They tried to transparent the rates that were being charged. It created a big chaos. They also were expecting that this change would also be accompanied by a huge investment because of investor confidence coming into Argentina, which would support the increase in prices. That did not materialize. So now you have higher prices of energy with tied to high inflation, exchange rate that also got higher, and the crisis just got worse. And an example of the consequences of that was, I don't know if you guys remember the blackout that they had during Father's Day in June of this year. While technically it was caused by a trip in a transmission line in their system, the reality is that their system could not react to this trip because it was economic dispatch. So they did not have enough redundancy. So the long-term solution is certainly investment, but the question is, how do they incentivize the investment community to come into Argentina? And that question is has not been answered, and it is a reason why temporary power providers like ourselves are still there, because nobody has stepped up to take over that. With the economic crisis that, I'm not an economist, I apologize if I use a term that's not appropriate, but with the economic situation that they're facing, being severe enough to dissuade investment, they've had to go back to the paternalist approach of the government guaranteeing the contracts. They bid 2,500 megawatts of renewables in 3 tranches. Today, Renewable, which is the name of the bids, 1 and 2 were awarded, are in construction, and I know that a lot of them are facing delays for political and administrative reasons. Renewable 3, the last award, those contracts never got signed. So it is currently Argentina is a big question mark about what's going to happen. And one of the questions that you were going to, I'll let you ask a question.
Yes, I was going to ask you the follow-up question, but I think also, I mean, it's interesting because what you're describing is there's a very similar issue in the oil and gas industry where essentially the country's not, the industry is not immune from all the problems in the broader economy. That's ultimately what it comes down to. And what I wanted to ask as a follow-up is, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, it's most likely based on the primary poll or the primary vote, Alberto Fernandez with Cristina Fernandez as vice president, he will be president. So are you concerned, all the whole system of subsidies, the system of the high rates of inflation, these were things that really started to occur under the Fernandez, correct. Cristina Fernandez and previously her husband Kirchner government. So are you are you concerned that there's going to be higher regulatory risk, or is it an opportunity because there might be more need for short-term power solutions?
So it's an interesting question because regardless of who wins the election, we don't foresee much happening in Argentina for the next 2 years. I think your statement of how the economics and how everything is tied in, I think the economic and financial management of the country is the primary problem that drags the energy sector behind in Argentina. And if a Fernandez ticket wins, where we believe that they will go back to the populist philosophy of regardless of cost, which will further dissuade investors to come in. And our company, which our business model is driven by going into chaotic situations and trying to cover that interim, what you think would be our natural market, but we would certainly be very concerned about the processes and procedures being in place to guarantee our contracts. We lived situations such as the 10 situations during the Cristina government when our contracts were renewed because the philosophy was to strong arm the investor in the thought that they were defending the people's interest, if that makes any sense. So we have a lot of concern of what's going to happen. We have a lot of assets. We have over close to 500 megawatts installed in Argentina that are still under contract and will remain under contract after the transition of government. And so we're truly concerned. As to the question of will we see opportunity there? Maybe, but we may not capitalize on it depending on how things mature.
I see. And Hector, let me go back to you with one specific question. I want to ask about the pipeline issue. So recently the AMLO government looked to renegotiate one of the pipeline contracts to bring natural gas from the U.S. to Mexico. So there have been reports that it's been resolved, but I was wondering if you could kind of explain where things stand with that And regardless of whether or not they came to an agreement, do you think that this has a longer term impact on, the sense of contract sanctity in the country right now?
Well, this is a good example of the mixed message that I was talking about. From one perspective, when the new administration started, the message that they're sending is we're going to review. We are going to find the just measures, and that CFE is first, or Mexico first, before I will say private investment. Now, where do we stand with that? Well, after 3 meetings with all the companies and 16 particular meetings, the 4 companies involved came into an agreement, but they're still pending two projects, 2 pipelines with what it used to be TransCanada, with TC Energy now. So what are the highlights of this agreement? And this is the other part of the message. Why? Because the president and the Mexican administration is sending a message that they were able to come into a settle that will be a savings of $4.5 billion. And with that, they can build 4 more power plants with 900 megawatts. What is behind this settlement? They changed the nature of the tariffs in terms of the guaranteed tariff that was financing the pipelines. They converted to a service tariff. Second, they extended the term for 10 more years, and the other one is they changed the clauses related to force majeure. So, and to conclude on this particular question is, well, the first mandate of this administration was to review, right? That's why this current administration is talking about an unbalance. Is saying, and this on the power sector is, you guys focus a lot on power generation, but we need to focus on transmission lines. They're claiming, oh, there were 1,400 permits, and there's a lot of bureaucracy, but not all the permits has to do with the contracts of the auctions. So it's sending a message first to Mexico. Why? Because it seems like a win to the company, to the national utility company.
Yeah, and I think it reaffirms people's concerns that there could be changes to contracts, and that the state companies are going to get, kind of special priority over private sector companies, when companies came in under the expectation that it would be a level playing field. So I think that's a big.
Very brief comment there. Well, the government has been very clear that they will respect the contracts and the rule of law. They don't need to worry with everything related to the past administration. But on the other hand, it's very clear that the priority is CFE. And there's a presidential mandate that they need to maintain the power generation from CFE, which this year is 54%. So, and there's no doubt about that. And in a lot of conversations, the CEO of Pemex has said, we need to avoid to buy electricity from the privates. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity, because, as I said, the growing demand of the electricity is growing, will continue to grow, especially on the industry sector. So there are other mechanisms that, as I said, there's a lot of potentials on wind, on solar, but again, there are other private efforts, for example, that are going on that direction.
Well, Leo, let me turn back to you. I mean, you talked about the kind of regional strategy, but could you tell us a bit more about which markets are most important for AES? What are the key markets, and what are the main sort of trends that you see in the power sector across the region? If you look at regions as a whole, and if you could talk specifically about some of the most important markets.
Yeah, I mean, AES is very prevalent in Latin America, right? So we have a presence in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Panama, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Panama, El Salvador. So let me start with the trends I outlined. Let me go to Latin America. How do those trends manifest there? I want to touch a little bit on Brazil, which is a big market we didn't touch on, and then I'll talk a little bit about the opportunities we see. So I talked about three large trends: fast, disruptive technological change, big environmental driver from investors and customers, and the amount of capital that is available. When you look at Latin America has different dynamics than the rest of the energy world. So in the developed world, energy demand is actually declining. Why? Because of efficiency. More efficient consumption, demand response, the transformation of how the networks are managed. So demand is declining. In Latin America, it's growing. So you have a first very different dynamic. The second one is, in the developed markets, all renewables are subsidized everywhere. And that is just a dynamic of the markets. In Latin America, renewables are cheaper than other technologies generally without subsidies, mostly. So if you take in Chile, you can build solar for $19 per megawatt hour without subsidies. In the US, you can build for $30 with subsidies. That has driven a penetration of renewables in Latin America that is economically driven, right? And then the last thing is Latin America has been very slow to adopt new technologies. So batteries, no change in regulation to incorporate batteries. Electric vehicles, they're non-existent mostly. Demand response, that doesn't exist. So I think this confluence of factors is actually very positive for investment. Because if you have a market that's growing a lot, the economic support, because renewables are cheap, and they haven't even started to incorporate the new technologies, that is excellent, because that means there will be a lot to be done there. So when we look at the future, we see these opportunities to invest there because of these dynamics. If you take Brazil, that we didn't touch on, the overarching theme for Brazil these days, the goal of the government, it seems to be very simple, which is transition the country from state-centered economy to market-centered economy. Everything they talk about are related to this simple thing. How does that translate to the electric sector? It's a big transformation, because if you take oil and gas, it means bring competition to the market. They're doing the largest ever auctions for oil fields, right, in Brazil. They want to make the gas market competitive. So it's a big transformation on that side. The second one is Brazil has been dominated by government intervention in the private sector. We had the Development Bank in Brazil holding equity ownership in hundreds of companies. No country has this. Some countries don't even have a development bank, by the way. And what do? They put a very young president for the development bank and said, sell everything. So they're selling stuff. So that is positive. The government's removing the tentacles from the economy. And then lastly, they want to do a reform of the energy market to make it a highly competitive market, hourly market, incentive for technologies, auctions, etc. So that is also very positive. So I think the dynamic there is actually very favorable. So if you take this context, these large-term to long-term trends, that we try to base our strategy on those long-term trends, and this specific dynamics in Latin America with very cost-efficient renewables, low penetration, and the capital to be invested in Latin America is also there. We think the potential for the region to attract a lot of investment in the coming years is also very, very large.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And I guess in terms of whether those new technologies are adopted will depend in part on the ability to kind of upgrade the regulations in order to make that possible, right? Because the capital's there, the technology's there. Why hasn't that happened yet? Do you think it's mostly a regulatory issue?
I think that each of the countries is different, but at the end of the day, I think countries were swept with this renewable trend. All of a sudden, you had large auctions, very cheap, and they went through a transformation in their governments. Let's take Chile, for example, to incorporate this into the plan. They say all of a sudden they don't need to be a coal country, they can be a renewable country. So now let's change all the regulations, change the auctions, change stuff so that the renewables will come in. So I think they were just busy with that. The next layer is the battery layer. The next layer is the electric vehicle. The next layer is demand response. It's just that the US has been in this dynamic for 10 years already, right? So it's way more developed. So I think as soon as the renewables, the ground rules are established, they'll go to the next step of the new technologies.
Okay, great. Well, let me make sure I leave some time for questions from the audience. So do we have a microphone? Do we have any questions? I guess we can start over here, and I'll take a few in a row.
Francisco Javier, independent consultant from Guadalajara. Hector, muchas gracias por tus comentarios. With AMLO's administration, renewable energy was really never part of his plan, not even during the elections. Like, there was no platform. And so how would you assess his appetite or his administration's appetite for renewables? Because there is a local industry, but what I'm seeing is that they're having a lot of difficulty scaling up. So for all of those like local installers in Mexico City, some that are emerging in Guadalajara, like, what is their next step? They have no clarity of policy. How do you assess that local market? Thank you.
Gracias. Well, two comments. I agree on the platform, because if we look at the high-level officials on energy, starting with the president, they all ran against the energy reform. So with that said, when the new regulation, this is my personal opinion, even though there are goals, renewable goals, clean energy goals, are based in the law, the transition law, well, the first thing that I can say is that everything related to the past administration, we need to change the conversation in Mexico. Now, second, in terms of the plans of, they are saying, our government is saying that they are aiming, yes, to have more clean energy. What are the different mechanisms that I see? Well, the question is still in the air if they're going to be, when is going to be the fourth auction. Secretary Nelly had said that there will be another auction, and we don't know when or how, or the guidelines, but she has said it will be where it's needed. She gave an example, Baja California, the peninsula of Baja California. Now, with that said, I see other mechanisms that are not a government effort, but there are private efforts, like the private auctions, for example. These private auctions, even though the goal is not to increase the clean energy, it's complementary, and that can help to meet our goals. The private auctions are aimed to put together, well, the buyers and the generators, private generators. And it's not a response to the lack of public auctions. And this is, I actually spoke to who's behind this, former colleague of mine, is Hector, we don't want to this is not a response to the lack of public auctions. We see an opportunity because in the past, the PPAs, we believe that they were inefficient, they were not competitive. So with that said, today, even though the resolution will be on January, he has said that there's a lot of appetite, and most of the sources precisely are wind and solar. Right now there are 70 companies, 35 generators and 35 companies that are interested. So I think that two things for that, your particular question is, I'm a positive, optimistic. I think we still need to wait and see. I do believe there's going to be changes like any administration. I believe in the medium term there will be some changes in the structure in the energy sector from the government perspective. And with that said, also in terms of how feasible the projects are, yes, I believe that Mexico First is a priority, but at the end of the day, they will need to see where the money comes from, right?
Thank you. Okay. Do you have a question on this side? I'm going to take a few in a row this time.
Hi. Hello. My name is Diogo Pereira from De Almeida Pereira. I'm a lawyer and I do some work in solar. I was wondering in Brazil, in terms of whether or not you thought what the relative roles of distributed generation, small scale solar plants would be versus larger scale solar investments and how that might play out.
Okay, we have a question.
Sorry. Hi, Pascal Siegel from Ankara Consulting. My question is for Mr. Moreno. Do you see investors looking to put their money into renewables over oil and gas? Or do you see LATAM countries seeking investments for LNG as a transition to, further down the road, renewables?
Thank you. Let's take one more. Is there one on this side? Okay, we can. Do you want? Oh, that's what you were going to ask. Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jorge Gastelumendi from the Nature Conservancy. A question for Mr. Moreno. We've seen in the past few months, some countries and some regions setting up targets for reaching renewable energy, net zero emissions. New York State, California, the UK, the Netherlands, and they are putting this as binding, so legally binding. I know that there is no silver bullet on how countries are moved towards reaching those targets, but in Latin America, my sense is that several of the countries have put very low, but first of all, they're not legally binding. Second of all, they're super low targets, 5%, 9%, 7%. Really hard to mobilize the market with those signals. So would you say that targets could play a role in Latin America to mobilize the market? And if not, what's the role of the private sector to actually push gently the government to move towards more aggressive or ambitious market developments towards applying renewables down the road?
Okay, well, why don't you start? So there were three questions. I think maybe you could address all of them on distributed generation, what investors and the targets.
Okay, so starting with the distributed generation. Distributed generation is very different depending on the location and geography, right? So if you take places that have very high insolation, like California and Hawaii, for example, it's very pervasive because it's economic. That's the first driver. And the second driver is the regulatory environment. So if you have net metering, that's a huge incentive, etc. So Brazil has negative dynamics in both, because the heavy load centers like São Paulo have low insulation. We're talking like 11%. Whereas in the northeast of Brazil, you have 45%. And secondly, the regulation is not there for you to be a medium, small consumer and take the benefit of that. So those are negative dynamics. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but it's not explosive growth. It is better to build in a place with high insulation. So I think that's how things are going to go. Now, with this change in the electric sector reform that I'm talking about, they will open the market for free customers to be lower tension customers. So hundreds of thousands of customers will come to the free market, so that will be an incentive. But I think the dynamics are not outstanding in that regard, just compared with other places. In terms of the oil and gas, so what we're seeing is, the appetite for renewable is tremendous from all different funds. So funds, some funds are just for renewable, and they won't take anything else. Some funds have caps on how much they can take of thermal energy, and that is usually around 30%, most of them. But what we've seen is that the appetite for gas and LNG is still very, very high. So if I go and try to sell a fund just to invest in LNG assets today, the appetite is very, very high. And why is that? Is because in some countries, LNG is needed because you're replacing coal or oil. And the renewables don't have a good dynamic. So let's take Vietnam. Yesterday, we actually announced 2.2 gigawatts of gas, new gas to be built in Vietnam and an LNG terminal. AES is going to do that. If we didn't do that, the government would build coal plants, because the rains a lot in the country, insulation is low, areas for wind is very limited, so there are no dynamics for renewable. If they build the renewable, it would be too expensive, and that's worse for the population. So I go back to AES's mission of improving lives. In the case of Vietnam, building an LNG plant is better than building renewables because it improves lives. Now, in the long term, I think this dynamic disappears because if batteries get very, very cheap, which is happening, this will happen, then batteries play the capacity role in the market and you don't need any thermal. So in the 20 to 30 year horizon, what I think will happen is you won't need any thermal. And this is independent of any government or anything. It's just the dynamics of the market will lead us there. The last one was, I can recall? Oh yeah, the targets. So what we've seen in Latin America is that, as I was mentioning before, we have the economics are driving the growth, right? So if you take Chile as an example, the economics are so favorable that no matter what the regulatory targets are, you get there. So what I think will happen is as these costs start to come down, the renewables are going to totally penetrate the region and are going to take over just because it's so much, much cheaper. In the US, because the price dynamics don't favor that, that's being driven by partly regulatory, but partly also customers. So take the largest, so data centers represent 3% of the global energy demand. Out of this 3%, that's data center, and they're growing 100% per year, right? Out of this 3%, half is Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. All of them are saying we'll be 100% renewable. So that drives the entire market without any regulations. So I think this pressure from investors, from market dynamics, and from customers will take us to an all-renewable world no matter what governments do. Doesn't mean we don't have to push for new regulations, but I think the market dynamics will get us there.
Thank you. Would you like to make
So I just want to add something to the gentleman's question on the percentage of renewables in Latin America being low. One of the things that needs to be addressed when having renewable penetration is reliability, which you, Lisa, brought up. And if you take cases like Australia and Europe, where they've faced grid instability and even blackouts because of the fast track penetration of renewables into the grid, destabilized their grid and just domino affected. I'm not sure that this is the reason why, but if I were a regulator in one of these countries, that I would take a much more cautious approach, which would answer why they take they set smaller goals and implement it. That's not disregarding what Mr. Moreno said, that the future may be renewable, but I personally believe that there's always going to be a need for a quick action thermal to stabilize the grid, especially as we industrialize Latin American countries, because you not only have active power needs, you have reactive power needs to be able to move industry, and that cannot be achieved with renewables. Unfortunately, batteries will help transients. They'll do primary and secondary, maybe, but not tertiary regulation in electrical systems.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think if you let the market dictate it, you don't run into these problems, right? It's places where high subsidies drove that you create a lot of problems. If you let the market regulate, things will be built as they're needed.
Do you have any comments about that? Okay. Are there any other questions from the audience? We have a question in the back and over here as well. I guess either order. I'll take both. Nate, why don't you just...
I have a question for Mr. Moreno. My name is Pablo Torres. I'm with Crown Agents USA, USAID contractor. We're doing a study on roadmap planning for distributed energy resources. It's primarily informed by experiences in the United States with utilities and states. And I go back to the question that Lisa asked about regulation. And you seem to sequentially do a stepwise process that focused first on battery storage, second on EVs, and third on demand response. And I was wondering if you truly see it that way and why that would be, if it has to be that way in emerging markets, or whether it really can be a planning process that addresses all of them at the same time.
Do you want to ask a question? Here's the microphone.
From Nexon Consulting. Yes, the question, I don't know who would take it, but basically it's on the markets, on the specific country markets. We talked a lot about, I mean, very, very informative, very good on Mexico, Brazil, the larger countries, but say the medium-sized countries, how do you visualize the penetration of renewables like in Colombia, Peru? I understand Uruguay, for instance, has a lot of solar energy penetration, but say a comment or something on Colombia and Peru, I mean, like looking at the intermediate countries, because there's a lot of population there, and there are countries that are, you know, have rising income. And their basis may be conventional energy, but they are also doing some efforts. There'll be some hurdles. So I just wanted to see if you could have a comment on basically Colombia, Peru, and another example, maybe if you have any.
Thank you.
Okay.
Do we have one more question? Could you introduce yourself too?
I'm Alvaro Cunto. Hi. Good morning. I'm Alvaro Cunto. Just a brief question about, probably for Mr. Moreno, what's your view on carbon capture, and do you see that being a potential solution for fossil fuels or not?
Yeah, so let me start with the batteries versus EV versus demand response. So what we are seeing is that the industry is transitioning the business model, right? So business model in the past, one large power generating station, lines, transmission, then distribution, to a customer, one consumer. That was the old world. New world, a network of dynamic, multi-technology sources, connected and not being optimized to a network of consumers that sometimes are also producers because they have batteries and they have stuff. So under that new world, and one more thing, today the electric grid is a network that has an enormous amount of excess unutilized capacity. That is everywhere. The transformers are at half load, the lines are not used all the time, the plants are running half the time, 30%, so there's unutilized capacity all the time. That's how these new business models emerge, like Uber and Airbnb, right? They took the unutilized capacity in the market, cars were sitting around, they connected that with customers. Airbnb, there were all these apartments, they connected that with people, people started connecting. So I think the three things, the batteries, the EVs, and the demand response, are tools to maximize the usage of the system or to reduce this excess capacity. So to the extent there's a more intelligent plan that uses all of the three sources to capture this excess capacity, that is the holy grail. It's just that the way things are developing, they're a little bit sprouting out, right? So Tesla launches a bunch of cars, they're expensive, only a few people buy them. Batteries are getting very cheap, people put them for different reasons. Some companies bid demand response products. But I think in the future, we're going to have a combination of all these resources that actually do the same thing, which is optimize the system by reducing excess capacity, all of them. So I think the combination of all of them will be the powerful element in the system. And by the way, vehicles are 95% of the new batteries put out there. Electric industry is only 5%. So if you now connect the vehicles to the grid and they become batteries in the grid, you multiply by 20 times the amount of batteries we have out there.
Did you want to comment on, there was a question about carbon capture and about markets in Peru and Colombia.
Oh yeah, I can talk about Colombia, Peru, I'm not familiar. I'm not sure if you guys.
I could talk Uruguay.
Okay. So Colombia, we love the market in Colombia, and I think President Duque has been an outstanding sponsor of renewable energy. He put that was one of his key goals. The entire government is behind it. He says publicly that he will drive this no matter what happens with his popular support. So it's immensely helpful to have his stance on this. Now, the internal dynamics are that the competitive renewable energy in Colombia is in the Guajira region, which is a very difficult region because it's ruled by indigenous populations and is very, very far from the load centers. So the government's launching auctions to capture this potential there. And these are the highest capacity factors for wind in the whole world. They're like 65%. We have the largest project there, 650 megawatt. The challenge there will be once they launch the auctions and people win, it's building 1,000-kilometer transmission lines through these areas. Once we start developing our projects, you have to reach agreement with 200 different communities. And you know how these things go, right? So it's uncertain how much risk there will be in this build out. But the government is very supportive, the environment is favorable, investor community very supportive on Colombia. Actually, they're so supportive that the government decided to launch the auction in contracts in Colombian peso, not dollars, because they found that, they're so positive about Colombia now that they can do that. So that is a positive indication, and everybody's going to bid anyway. So I think Colombia is on the right track.
Great, thank you. Do you want to make a comment about?
Just, I want to say Uruguay has a high participation of wind power more than solar. They invested, and they are a great example of the chicken or the egg issue of renewables. They took it upon themselves to invest in renewables prior to it being as accessible, as financially accessible, as cheap as it could be. They're not getting maximum utilization out of the power that they invested in, but it was a political and an environmental position that drove them to do it. That though incentivizes other markets to invest, and it then makes the technology cheaper, because the more people, if people don't buy it, it can't get cheaper. So they were early adopters. Maybe some internally have questioned it, and we were there in Uruguay for several years because they're highly hydro dependent, and El Niño basically took their hydro down to a level that was unsustainable. Argentina, were their natural exporter of energy, basically said, we're going to cut you off because we're also in a crisis. And they required us to be there. In that same time, they were investing in the wind power. We saw them implement it, but it did not displace our power, unfortunately. But it showed the region that it can be done. So it made it possible for maybe other countries to step up and say, if they can do it, we can do it. So it was a positive for the region in itself.
Thank you. Well, I think this has been a really interesting discussion, raises a lot of questions about what will happen that's driven by the market versus what will happen that's driven by policy. So I think in many cases it remains to be seen. But I really want to thank all of you for your comments. I think this is a very, very interesting discussion. And we're going to take a short break so everyone can have their lunch, and then we'll close with the panel on natural gas and LNG. So thank you very much to all of you.